Hi there, my name is Bethan. I work in the Employee Wellbeing Service in Cwmtaf Morgannwg University Health Board, and this is a recording of our low mood workshop. Video you can go through to learn a little bit more about low mood and how it might affect us, and what you might be able to do to support your wellbeing and improve your mood if you are experiencing low mood. Just a quick note to say that during this session, there will be some different reflection points, different things that you might want to reflect on, different questions I might ask. So you might find it helpful to grab some pen and paper just so you can make some notes and sort of pause the video at those points and jot down some reflections and ideas. So do feel free to kind of pause the video and go and grab that now if you need to. Another note to say that whenever we are thinking about our well-being or reflecting on our well-being, sometimes things can feel upsetting for us or difficult for us. If after this video you feel that you do need some further support, please do either refer yourself to the Wellbeing Service via our access form, which will be linked in the description, or reach out to our employee assistance programme Vivup, who provide counselling for staff and a 24/7 telephone helpline, all for free. Again, their phone number will be linked in the description as well. Also during this session, because we are discussing low mood and depression, we are going to be talking about things like thoughts of suicide. If that is upsetting for you or you do feel you need support for that, again, there'll be information in the description of this video. I would encourage you just to kind of check in with yourself as you're going through the session. If you feel like you need to pause, take a break, then that's absolutely fine. Feel free to do that. So this session will be split into two parts, very similar to a lot of our workshops. The first part, we're going to be looking at what is low mood, how might we experience that in terms of our thoughts, our emotions, maybe our behaviors, maybe what we feel in our body. Also looking at what is the difference between low mood and depression, kind of look at that a bit briefly as well. The second part of it then will be looking at things that we can do to improve our mood if we are experiencing low mood over time as well. So, diving right in then to think about what low mood is. Low mood is a very normal part of being a human. It's something that we all experience from time to time. Feeling low doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with us or that we are experiencing depression. It's very normal for humans to have low mood. We often use low mood to describe feeling sad, feeling down, or feeling unhappy. Usually, when we experience these low moods as humans, they usually will lift within a few days. So it's not normally something that we have that is kind of long lived. Usually, it's something that will lift within a few days, maybe even in a few hours, depending on maybe what has triggered it or what's going on for us that day. There are changes that we can make to boost our mood. And although feeling low is a normal part of feeling human, there are things that we can do to support ourselves when we're experiencing that low mood and to boost our mood overall. Just a quick note then about the difference between low mood and depression. So, low mood, we've talked about being a very normal part of being a human. Sometimes it's in response to things that have happened in our life, sometimes not. It's very normal for us to experience that. Usually, it's something that will lift within a few days. Depression is a little bit different. Depression is a persistent low mood that lasts for a significant amount of time for prolonged periods. So rather than having something that's lifting within a few hours or in a few days, depression is something that is lasting for a much more significant amount of time and it's much more persistent for somebody. Depression can come as a response to trauma or difficult life experiences, stress, the world around us. Not always. Sometimes people experience depression and there's no obvious kind of trigger or cause externally, nothing that has particularly happened in their life to cause that. Sometimes we might not be able to pinpoint a cause. Sometimes it feels like it's there and it's kind of out of the blue. There is a really, really nice video that is linked in the description below called the Black Dog video. It's a really nice way of describing the difference between depression and low mood. So I'd really encourage you to watch that later on if that's something that you're interested in. Again, it's linked in the description there for you. So, in terms of what we might feel, kind of like emotions that we might feel if we're experiencing a low mood or a depression, we might feel sad, lonely, or kind of isolated. Empty is quite a common one. So, sometimes people don't necessarily feel sadness or kind of low mood. What they actually experience is a kind of emptiness. They sort of feel devoid of emotion. We might experience little or no pleasure in things that usually make us feel good, or little or no interest in doing things, maybe lack of motivation and things like that. We might feel quite irritable or even angry. So maybe we're kind of snapping at people more than usual, feeling like we've got less patience or less tolerance than we normally would have. We might feel worthless or hopeless and generally feel quite low. So those are some of the common emotions we might experience if we're experiencing a low mood or a depression. In terms of how we might behave or act, then we might be avoiding contact with others or be kind of disconnecting from others. We might be kind of isolating ourselves, withdrawing from other people quite a lot. We might be neglecting our hobbies and interests, again, maybe because of this lack of motivation or the lack of interest that we have around things. We might start to neglect those things that usually help us to feel good. We might start neglecting our personal hygiene. That's a really common one for people. We might spend a lot more time alone. Again, if we're isolating ourselves quite a lot, might stop doing things we enjoy. We might avoid going to work or find it difficult to come to work if we're experiencing low mood. We might find that we're staying in bed for longer periods of time. Sometimes, if we're experiencing low mood or depression, our bed can feel a bit like our safe space. And if we're there, we're kind of protected from the rest of the world. Nothing can sort of get to us, nothing can harm us. It can help us to kind of sometimes it can feel like it helps us to avoid those things that maybe would make us feel worse or things that are more difficult for us. This can sometimes lead to people sleeping more than usual as well because they are staying in bed for longer periods of time. Although it can feel quite tempting to stay in bed for longer periods of time, often if we're just lying in bed a lot of the time, that gives us that unfortunately tends to breed more kind of low mood because we're not being particularly active. And we'll talk about the kind of relationship between activity and our mood later on. We might be avoiding daylight. We might be drinking more alcohol than usual. A lot of people will use alcohol as a way of trying to improve their mood. Sometimes it might feel like alcohol gives us that short-term boost in mood, but often in the long run, it tends to make us feel worse. Alcohol is what we call a depressant. What that means is it kind of slows down our central nervous system. So in the moment, it can sometimes feel relaxing or feel like it boosts our mood. But as alcohol starts to wear off, it often mimics a lot of signs of things like low mood and anxiety and depression. So although it might feel good in the short term, in the long run, as it starts to wear off, it often worsens our mood. The tricky thing is then for some people, that's how we can get caught in that vicious cycle because we drink to try and feel better. We get maybe that brief feeling of feeling a bit better. Then, as the alcohol wears off, we start to feel a bit worse. And so we drink again to try and get that feeling back. And so you can see maybe sometimes how that vicious cycle can appear with low mood. Sometimes people might eat more or less as well. This can be related to appetite changes. So, low mood and depression can have an impact on our appetite. But sometimes this is more a behavioral thing as well. So, sometimes people might eat more when they're experiencing low mood to try and make themselves feel better. A little bit similar to alcohol. A lot of us experience positive feelings when we're eating food that we enjoy. And so, some of us might use that as a bit of a coping strategy to try and improve that mood then. In terms of how our body might respond, some people might experience kind of unexplained aches and pains in the body. So they're not really explained by anything else. There's no injury or anything like that going on. It's just how our body's responding to feeling low or experiencing that depression. We might experience a lack of energy or kind of feeling exhausted, feeling quite lethargic. Sometimes people describe low mood and depression as feeling like they're dragging themselves through the day because they're kind of feeling quite tired and quite lethargic and they're lacking in that motivation. We might experience loss of libido or changes in our libido. We might experience speaking and moving more slowly than usual, sometimes thinking more slowly than usual as well. Sleeping too much or too little. Again, this can be because when we're feeling low, our sleep is kind of naturally disrupted as part of that. Sometimes we end up sleeping too much because, again, that bed becomes a bit of our safe space and it's a way of maybe avoiding the real world. We might again experience those appetite changes, so kind of feeling more hungry or less hungry than usual. We might experience changes to menstrual cycle. That's quite a common one for a lot of people who are kind of menstruating age. Again, lethargic and disturbed sleep. In terms of why we might feel low mood or depression, then there's a whole bunch of reasons why somebody might experience that low mood. It might be because of stress. It can actually be because of lack of sleep. We've talked about the fact that low mood impacts our sleep and sometimes means that we get less sleep than usual. So you can see how there's a bit of a vicious cycle there as well. Experiencing some kind of loss or bereavement. So that might not necessarily be loss of a person, through a death. It could be loss, like loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of a friendship. It can be those kind of losses as well. Genetics or predisposition, there's some theories that suggest that some of us might be predisposed to kind of experiencing low mood and depression. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are, definitely going to experience that, but we might be predisposed to it. And so when these difficult things happen in life, we might be more likely to experience low mood or depression then. Might be as a result of a kind of learned behavior or a kind of family script. So we kind of maybe learn how our family responds to difficult life situations and kind of adapt our behavior to that. Trauma, difficulties in relationships or conflict, relationship breakdowns, financial problems. That's a really major cause of low mood or depression for a lot of people. Certain medications, the side effect can be low mood. So codeine-based medications, things like antihistamines as well. Diet, there's a huge link between the food we eat and the mood that we feel. There is a neurotransmitter, a kind of chemical in our brain called serotonin. One of the things that we think serotonin is responsible for is the stabilization of mood. We're not 100% sure what causes depression, but research has found that people experiencing depression tend to have lower levels of serotonin. Interestingly, we often think that serotonin kind of originates in the brain because it is a neurotransmitter, but actually about 90% of our serotonin we think actually originates in our gut. So what that means is the food that we eat and, whether we're getting the right number of nutrients and things like that might well have quite a major impact on some of these chemicals and neurotransmitters that we think help to stabilize our mood. So our diet can be a really, really important part of making sure that our emotional well-being is as positive as it can be. The gut is often being described now as the second brain because of the impact that it does have on these things. Menopause, so for people experiencing the menopause, that can have an impact on our mood. Similarly, the menstrual cycle, so at different parts of our menstrual cycle, we may be more likely to experience low mood. Alcohol and using alcohol can kind of create signs of low mood or depression. Again, family scripts and behaviors we talked about earlier. Experiencing work-related stress or problems or family-related problems, and then using any kind of recreational drugs. Some of those can come with them. Kind of side effects of kind of low mood or depression, particularly as they start to wear off, kind of similar to alcohol in a way. Again, there might not always be an obvious cause for why we're experiencing low mood or depression, but these are maybe some common things that can happen to sort of trigger those. In terms of how we might think, then, what thoughts we might experience, we might get a lot of gloomy or negative thoughts, things like, I'm useless, I can't go on like this, I'm a failure, those sorts of thoughts. Sometimes we can be very critical towards ourselves when we're experiencing that low mood as well. So our self-talk, the way we talk to ourselves mentally, can become quite negative. We might get quite a lot of anxious or worried thoughts. We might experience problems with memory. We might feel quite confused as well and have difficulty concentrating. Again, if we're experiencing a lot of those negative thoughts, we might experience kind of low self-esteem. We might also experience thoughts of suicide if we are experiencing a low mood or depression. Thoughts of suicide are much more common than we often realise. Some of the most recent figures suggest in Wales about 1 in 20 of us every year will experience thoughts of suicide. There's a whole range of thoughts that we might experience around this. For some of us, it might be fleeting thoughts, such as, I wish this would all end, or I hope I don't wake up in the morning, those kind of fleeting thoughts. For some of us, it might be that we actually have a plan or an intention to end our life. If you are experiencing those thoughts of suicide, there is some information in the description of this video, kind of signposting to further sources of support. Please be assured it's very, very common for people to experience these thoughts when they are experiencing low mood or depression. And there is help and support out there if you do need that. In terms of what can feed low mood, then it's often useful to think of what we call patterns of unhelpful thinking. So, often what happens when we're experiencing low mood is that our thoughts will have an impact on our feelings, our emotions, and that will then have an impact on our behaviors. So, let's say, for example, the example we've got on the slide here is the negative thought or cognition: I am no good at anything. Very common thought that people might experience with low mood or depression. If we're having a thought, I'm no good at anything, that is probably going to bring with it some negative emotions. So, experiencing sadness or depression. Because of that sadness or depression, that might trigger then us to behave in a way towards others that's unhelpful. So maybe we kind of decide to withdraw from other people. We decide not to engage with others. We decide not to kind of go out and all this kind of stuff. What that then might create is a negative response from other people towards us. So maybe they stop inviting us places or they avoid us. And that then feeds back into that negative thought of I'm no good at anything. So there's this really vicious cycle that happens when we're experiencing low mood or depression that's often triggered by that first thought, that kind of negative, unhelpful thought that happens in the first place. So one of the things that we can learn to do, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is actually learn how to kind of challenge some of these unhelpful thoughts that come up for us, to help break that cycle down as well. We can also intervene at the kind of behavior stage of this cycle, so we can actually kind of change some of our behaviors as well. So maybe rather than avoiding people, not going out, not speaking to people, we can actually change some of that. And again, that will help to change that negative cognition as well. So we'll talk about that in the second part today. But what a lot of people experience with kind of low mood and depression is what we call these negative automatic thoughts. So these negative thoughts that just seem to pop into our head. We often say that these are traps. So these negative automatic thoughts are often quite twisty. They kind of twist our thinking. So we often ignore a lot of evidence around our thoughts. So we tend to believe that negative thought and buy into it at face value. And there might be loads of evidence to say that actually it's not true and we don't need to believe it. But often, because of the way that these negative automatic thoughts twist our thinking, becomes very difficult to kind of pay attention to that evidence and kind of think through that thought. They're often quite resistant, so it's often very difficult for people to turn these negative automatic thoughts off, and they tend to be very automatic. So again, they tend to appear quite quickly without us doing anything. They're often quite pessimistic, so the negative automatic thoughts, they tend to make us feel negative emotions, so things like sadness, worry, and anger. And they can often be quite sneaky, so often we get these thoughts popping into our head during the day, and we're not always that aware of what we're thinking. Part of the challenge of learning to manage low mood or depression is actually learning to recognize what those thoughts are that we're experiencing. It's often catching them in the first place that's the hardest bit. Once we've caught them and we're aware of how we're thinking, that's when we are able to make those changes that we'll talk about in a little bit. So before we move on to part two, now would be a really helpful time to grab that pen and paper that we mentioned at the start. Pause the video here for a few minutes and just reflect on this question. How do you notice when you're feeling low? So we've talked about lots of different common signs of low mood or depression in terms of our thoughts, our behaviors, our body sensations, our emotions, or our feelings. Maybe take a little bit of time now to make some notes about what you experience and what you notice in yourself when you're feeling that low mood or that depression. Okay, so moving on to part two now, then hopefully you've had a bit of chance to reflect on what you experience when you have that low mood or that depression. What we're going to be looking at now is how we might be able to manage low mood. Now, a really big thing that we're going to be looking at in this section is the relationship between what we do and how we feel. So, when we feel good, when we're experiencing kind of positive mood, we tend to spend time doing things that we enjoy. And that enjoyment that we get from the things that we do tends to then feed into that positive mood that we're experiencing. The reverse of this is also true. So when we feel low, we tend to do less overall. And so then we get less chance to experience pleasure and motivation. And that then feeds our low mood. What's really interesting about motivation is that we tend to, as humans, we tend to wait for motivation to happen before we do something. But often what is true is that it's doing something that gives us the motivation to do more of it. So when we're experiencing a low mood or depression, we tend to become less active than usual. And I don't necessarily mean in a physical kind of exercise sense, but less active overall in terms of engaging with different activities. Um, and what that does is that kind of breeds more of this lack of motivation. If we are able to kind of push ourselves to do things, to engage in doing things that we enjoy, that can actually create more motivation to carry on. This might not necessarily just be about things we enjoy either. Sometimes it might be about things that we need to do or we have to do. So, kind of housework, life admin, all that kind of stuff. So, what we're essentially talking about is what we call behavioral activation. So, the idea behind this again is that we can be passive and wait for external motivation that will help us to kind of do something that makes us feel good, that breaks that cycle of low mood. But unfortunately, that can often leave us feeling quite helpless. And again, often that motivation actually comes from doing the activity. So, what we're talking about here in behavioral activation is basically increasing our level of activity, even if we don't feel like it to begin with. But that's a bit more of a proactive approach that has a really large evidence base behind it. If we do more of what matters to us, we tend to feel better about ourselves. We tend to experience more of that positive mood, and that creates a bit more of a helpful, positive cycle for us. So, in terms of how we do it, first thing we need to do is learn about that vicious cycle. So, that cycle of kind of lack of activity or lack of motivation, and we've already just done that. Then we want to start noticing, so monitoring our daily activity levels, looking at where we do engage with activities that are helpful for us and where maybe we don't. Identifying our values and goals, so identifying what matters to us and what's important to us, and then looking at what we call simple activation in terms of a way of increasing those activity levels. So, thinking about activity monitoring, then, firstly, what can be really helpful is keeping a little bit of a diary, hour by hour, of a kind of average week, just to see what activities we tend to do throughout the day. There is a little kind of worksheet for this, again, linked in the description here, if this is something that you want to do as a worksheet. It's a really helpful way of looking at those activity levels over the week and seeing where there might be gaps where we could do something that actually would help us to feel good or would help us to feel better about ourselves. Then what we're going to do is think about how we can identify our values. So really thinking about what's important to us in life and what we want to spend our life doing, thinking about what we really value, what kind of life we want to live, and maybe what's holding us back from living that life. Some of what we're talking about here comes from a therapy approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short. In ACT, they talk about kind of identifying our values and taking committed action towards living that values-based life. There's a really helpful video here called Monsters on the Boat. Again, it's linked in the description below if that's something that you want to look at. It's a really helpful video that will guide you through a bit of an analogy that talks about the importance of identifying our values and the importance of living the type of life that we want, despite maybe the difficult emotions, difficult thoughts, difficult body sensations that we might experience. So it's definitely worth taking a bit of time to do that. There's also a link in the description below to a list of values, a values checklist that you can go through to kind of see what values you seem to identify with most. It's well worth considering this, and it might be a really good chance now to kind of pause this video and maybe reflect a little bit on these values, have a little think about what's really important to you and what you really want to commit to doing in your life. Once we've identified those values, then we want to do some what we call simple activation. So think about what tends to boost your mood the most and start with that. Think about what small steps you can take. What is the smallest step you can make? If we are experiencing lack of motivation because of low mood or depression, it can sometimes be really, really hard to motivate and push ourselves to do these things. So sometimes our brain gets quite overwhelmed by big tasks. So let's say, for example, what really helps to boost your mood is going for a walk. That might feel quite overwhelming because we've got to get changed, we've got to put our trainers on, we've got to get out of the house, we've got to go for the walk, we've got to come back, get changed, shower. That might feel quite big. So maybe think about what's a smaller step that you can take. Maybe one day it's just putting that walking kit on. Just getting changed into your walking kit. Maybe you don't go out for the walk that day, you just do that. Maybe the next day, then you put the trainers on. Maybe the next day, you open the front door and walk outside. Maybe then you go to the next lamppost. Maybe you go to the end of that street. So you can take it in kind of small steps. You can also create what we call an activity menu. So think about the things that help to boost your mood or help you to feel motivated or positive afterwards. So it might be things like exercise, meeting a friend, cooking a meal, cleaning the house, taking a bath, listening to some music, doing something nice for somebody else. Make a bit of an activity menu of activities you know help you to feel good that you can kind of pick from when you want to kind of schedule them in. And then schedule some of these activities into your week, make it a part of your day. So be quite specific with this. Maybe make a note of what the activity is, when you plan to do it, where you plan to do it, and who you might do the activity with, whether that might be alone or whether it might be somebody else. So I'd encourage you now just to pause the video here and maybe start to have a bit of a reflection of the things that help you to feel good and the things that boost your mood. And maybe start thinking about ways you can fit some of these into your week. On top of behavioral activation, then, something that can also be really useful is challenging our thoughts and our perceptions. We looked at that vicious cycle earlier on where those kind of negative thoughts often feed our difficult emotions and maybe those behaviors then that kind of again feed that negative thought. So what can be really helpful is kind of challenging the way that we think. Firstly, thinking about that negative self-talk. I mentioned kind of briefly earlier on how if we're experiencing low mood or depression, our self-talk can become quite negative. Self-talk basically is a lot of us have a kind of inner dialogue with ourselves throughout the day. So mentally, we will talk to ourselves through the day. And often that self-talk can become really quite negative. Maybe we tend to kind of criticize or beat ourselves up. So again, it's worth reflecting, and maybe this is a moment where you pause the video and again grab that pen and paper and reflect. How do you talk to yourself through the day? Do you tend to criticize or beat yourself up, or do you treat yourself with kindness and compassion? Something that I think is really important to reflect on here is, do you talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend? Often when we're experiencing that negative self-talk, the way that we talk to ourselves is very different to how we would talk to our loved ones or our friends. We would often never say the things that we say to ourselves to other people. Sometimes the way that we talk to ourselves is worse than we'd ever talk about our worst enemy. So it's really worth reflecting on that. Again, maybe this is a moment to kind of pause and reflect on what your self-talk looks like. Here's a really helpful way that we can start to kind of challenge our thoughts and kind of our perceptions on things. So these kind of negative automatic thoughts we notice. This is what we call the 3 C's of cognitive therapy. So cognitive meaning our thoughts. The first one is to catch. So identify the thought that came before the emotion. Sometimes we need a little bit of hindsight with this. Sometimes it's kind of looking back once we've felt a negative emotion. But what was the thought that came before that? Check on the thought, so reflect on how accurate and useful the thought is. Again, we tend to take our thoughts at face value. A lot of our thoughts are not necessarily facts. They're often just our brain's best guess or opinion about something. And then you can change the thought. So change the thought to a more accurate or helpful one as needed. This doesn't necessarily mean a more positive thought. We're not necessarily just trying to think positive, but we're just trying to be more accurate or more helpful in our thinking. This is a good example of a thought record sheet that you might use as a bit of a journaling task, maybe. And again, this is linked in the description to this video. So the idea behind this is you will write the kind of situation or the trigger that kind of came that you were in, the situation you were in at the time when you felt that negative emotion or you experienced that negative thought. So that might be what happened, where you were, when, kind of time of day, who you were with, how. So you're just making a note of all of the situation that you're in. Then you're going to talk about your feelings in the next column. So you're going to name the emotion you felt. So maybe low mood, maybe anxiety, whatever it is. And then on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being, no emotion at all, and 100 being as intense as the emotion could possibly be, we're going to rate how strong that emotion felt. So maybe it's a 80%, maybe it's a 50%, whatever you feel. It can also be worth asking what you feel in your body and where you felt it. So any body sensations that came up for you as well. In the next column, then you go in to list the unhelpful thoughts or images that you had. So what went through your mind at the time? What did those kind of thoughts or images mean to me? Or what was I saying to myself? Any thoughts that you noticed coming in? Then with those unhelpful thoughts, in the next column, you're going to list facts that support the unhelpful thoughts. So any evidence you can find that supports it. The next column, then, you're going to list any facts or evidence that are against the unhelpful thought. In the next column, you're going to try and come up with an alternative, more realistic and balanced perspective. And then in the last column, you're going to re-rate the emotion again. So say I was experiencing low mood at an 80% intensity. After I've gone through that evidence for and against, how do I feel about it now? Is it still an 80% or is it a 50% or is it a 20%? Often there'll be a reduction in that emotion when we've thought that thought through to the end and we've thought about maybe a more alternative, more realistic, balanced perspective. It's well worth practicing this. Again, there's a link to this record sheet that you can use moving forward if you wanted to kind of practice it. Thinking about things that we can do then to support our overall well-being and our overall emotional well-being and our overall mood. Firstly, mindfulness can be a really helpful practice for people who are experiencing kind of low mood or depression, or even things like stress, anxiety, maybe any difficult emotion. There's a lot of misconceptions about what mindfulness is. I think this picture really demonstrates mindfulness quite nicely. So in this picture, we've got two people here walking through a park. And the one person here is thinking about loads of stuff. They're thinking about the fact the car needs an MOT. They're thinking about work. They're thinking about bills they need to pay. They're thinking about song that's stuck in their head. They're thinking about loads of stuff. And while they're doing that, there's no space for them to just be in this moment, just think about the experience of walking through the park. The other person here is totally immersed in that experience. They're thinking about the nature around them, how the sun feels on them, how their body feels as they move, the conversation they're having with their friend. They're really immersed in that moment. So, mindfulness really is the act of paying attention to our present moment experience, being more aware of our present moment, not just noticing what's going on around us, but what is our internal experience? What thoughts, body sensations, and emotions are we experiencing day to day? So, that's a really useful technique. Mindfulness, they use practices like meditations and other informal practices to learn ways of doing this. We do offer a lot of mindfulness courses and support within the Wellbeing Service. So again, if that's something that you're interested in, the access form is linked in this video. Please do make a referral to us to access that support. Another thing that can be really helpful is keeping a journal. A journal is a really good way of externalizing our thoughts, processing things, and understanding more about how we feel. So, a journal is a really personal experience. There's no right or wrong in terms of how you keep that journal. But some questions on the screen that might be useful would be: who did I enjoy spending time with today? What have I noticed about myself today? How did I feel today? What emotions did I notice? Did I experience any difficult thoughts or emotions today? Maybe this is a chance to challenge some of those difficult thoughts. Why did my mood change after my meeting or after going out or whatever it might be? What do I feel grateful for today? This is a really good way, like I said, of externalizing our thoughts and emotions and just being able to process and let things out a little bit more. Self-care is then really, really important if we are experiencing low mood. Sometimes burnout can happen when we experience too much stress for too long, and sometimes burnout is what can lead to feelings of low mood. So it is important that we take time out for ourselves during our week and ask ourselves, what do I need right now? How can I care for myself today? Just before we wrap up our session, then it might be useful to pause the video again just to have a final reflection on what you have discovered or learnt on the session today. So we've got some quick questions on the video here that you might find helpful, maybe asking what has resonated with me most during this session, what have I noticed about my well-being during this session, and what is one thing I can do to support my well-being after this session. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We hope this has been a helpful session for you. For more information on the services that we offer within the Wellbeing team and for a link to our access form where you can request support from us, please visit our website, which is ctmuhb.nhs.wales/staff/employee wellbeing. We also do have an employee assistance program called Vivup. Vivup offer a free 24/7 telephone helpline and free counselling for all staff. So if you do feel like you need to talk to somebody after watching this, please do give them a call on 03303 800 658.